welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to Syosset Public Library's Turn the Page podcast. Today, we are thrilled to have author Sean O'Brien on our podcast. Sean O'Brien has worked as the chief speechwriter to then Vice President Joe Biden and the special assistant to President Barack Obama, and then as the Pentagon as chief speechwriter to Director of Defense Ash Carter. He has written over 300 speeches as well as op-eds for national publications, and he is also part of the adjunct faculty at Georgetown University. Sean is the author of the new book that he has written for children, middle grade age, called House Clubhouse. And it's an exciting blend of time travel and history and follows the adventure of two first children, Marissa and Clara, that travel back in time to the days of President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903 in an exciting adventure out west on a train adventure. So thank you so much, Sean, for being on our podcast today. We're thrilled to talk about this book.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. And it's especially exciting to be talking to Syosset. Look, I made several trips out to Sagamore Hill in the process of writing this book. And, you know, at one point I even just kind of sat on the porch on the rocking chairs and just kind of thinking about it. And it's really so beautiful out there. So I appreciate this chance to talk to you.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I visited Sagamore Hill so many times, and it's just like, as the summer White House, there's just such a peace and serenity to the place. And then I found out so much about President Theodore Roosevelt that I think a lot of kids and readers of all ages will find so interesting and fascinating. I didn't realize he founded all those national parks and all the work he did out west like that. It was really fascinating. I felt like I knew him, like I knew that, you know, he did a lot of great things, you know, and in that time period, he was progressive for what he could do, you know, and I feel like he's kind of misunderstood, you know, there's so much, you know, so I think this was a great introduction to kids about President Theodore Roosevelt. I thought it was really interesting, the book, and I especially liked how you wrote from the perspective of his children, Theodore Roosevelt's children, because I feel like I've seen other time travel children's books, but never like written from the perspective of the historical kids. Like it's always been about maybe, you know, it would be President Roosevelt, just and then the kids kind of chronicling around and following the adventure, but they were the direct, you know, speakers in the story. They were, you know, really driving the story forward. And I found that really interesting. So the kids,
he had an incredible family. Like there were 6 kids and something like 24 pets at the White House at the time. And there were even a few that they had to leave in Long Island. They couldn't bring the bear with them. And so, you know, but each one of them just kind of has this really, prominent Washingtonian in her own right. And, you know, Quentin went off to be a, World War I pilot. And, and Ethel, actually, she's the reason we still have Sagamore Hill. She came back to, the estate and she ended up preserving it. So, yeah, it's fun to actually just kind of, put it as kids talking to kids as opposed to, trying to connect with grown-up historical figures. And they're important and they're in the book, but yeah, I really enjoyed kind of trying to build those characters.
Yeah, I think you did a great job. So these two sisters, the first children, because their mom is just been elected president, and their sisters, Marissa and Clara, and they discovered the secret tunnel in the White House that leads them back in time to the time of Teddy Roosevelt. And I thought it was so cool how you kind of like, they found the clothing, like, and then it kind of, they transported it like back. It was just like seamless, because it was like, oh, it was a piece of history. Like they found clothing from the time period of the Roosevelt.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time trying to figure that one out. And by we, I say, my kids actually, this is kind of their idea, to give them credit. Jay and Claire, and they had come up with the original concept of, wouldn't it be cool to go back in time in the White House and all this, but then also along the way they were my toughest editors, and things like, okay, yeah, but isn't anybody going to notice that they're wearing, modern clothes? Okay, well, so how are we going to get them into, some dresses that fit the period and all that? And, we went through a whole bunch of different drafts, and it was things like that that kept on changing. But I like where we ended up there. So I'm glad that you thought it kind of worked seamlessly there.
Yeah, because I was like, it happened like very quickly, and I'm like, wow, they traveled back in time, and it's like it wasn't like just a direct jump. I feel like, which sometimes like it was like it just kind of seamlessly moved along. I'm like, wow, they're like, and there's the White House. It's like, it has such historic significance, and it's like they're living the history of the time. I thought that was really cool, like going back in time like that. And you said the inspiration to your story, your daughters came up with the idea to this story.
Yeah, it really did, and they ended up kind of just adding a whole lot of flavor to it along the way. And they actually both wrote pieces of it too. There's parts of the text that came straight from their pen.
Yeah,
so I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, and especially like writing the Roosevelt's children, like Quentin, like I feel like he's such like he got a really good sense of humor. Like I felt like I really got, a lot of the kids' personalities. Like, how did you do that so well? Like, did you look at a lot of historic letters? Like, how did you find like these characters' voices from history? Like, it was just really great how you did that.
Yeah, shout out to libraries here. And I actually went to the DC Public Library and I read Alice Roosevelt's book. She wrote a biography. Several of the people who had worked there had also written biographies. Quentin and Ethel hadn't actually written things, but they were written about in all of these things, including an incident where Quentin really did smuggle a pony up to the second floor of the White House in the elevator to bring to his brother Archie, who was sick with the measles. So, those type of things kind of became the seed of the story. But knowing that, okay, here's a kid who would do something like that, let me take that character and try to bring it to life, right? And so eventually he sort of became, and same thing with his sister Ethel, they both became these characters that are, they're fictional, they're created for the book, but they're really based on a lot of the things that we know about them. Like Ethel, for example, apparently, was much more mischievous than Quentin. She was just better at getting away with it, according to the memoirs. So yeah, and I think that's cool.
Yeah, it was really cool how we got to like, see the kids alive in the story, to these real people that had lived, long ago, the Quentin, Ethel, all the children. And I really loved that piece from the story. That was really funny, like learning about like all the animals that they had as pets. Like that was, I think the kids will get a kick out of that too.
That was one of the things that kind of hatched our interest in the first place. We actually had a little book on White House pets, and it's got a bunch of different chapters on, okay, John Quincy Adams had an alligator, which is strange, and there were other things. Then you get to the Teddy Roosevelt chapter, and it's like half the book. it's all the crazy pets that you think of were there, and that sort of reflects kind of who Teddy Roosevelt was too. He was so he was very impatient. He was very, very energetic. I'm sure he would have gotten in trouble in class a lot for not sitting still. But he loved the outdoors and he loved animals, and so the teddy bear, it's actually named after him. So it's kind of natural that his kids would take after him, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and we also learning about, like, in your research, was there any specific fact that you didn't even know, like, about the Roosevelt family, like other interesting facts? I think you wove a lot into the story, but anything else like really interesting about the family?
Well, yeah. So there was something that, I didn't really know too much about Teddy Roosevelt's kind of early years. Like he grew up in a brownstone in New York, and so did I, and so things like that are kind of an interesting connection. But that, there was one tragic day when he lost both his wife and his mother to two separate illnesses, and then there was a daughter that was left behind. That was Alice. But he ended up kind of just heading out west and, becoming a rancher and trying to kind of run away from all of his problems. And so he and Alice had this complicated relationship their whole life, that sort of kind of stems from that. And things like that, when you find out the real human stories behind these historical figures, you find out that they're absolutely not perfect. That they all have flaws. I think part of the reason that people ended up really catching on to the Hamilton musical is that Lin-Manuel Miranda did a very good job of just kind of capturing, the imperfectness, the pettiness, the weirdness of that, resides in everybody. But I think learning about those sides of Teddy Roosevelt and his kids really kind of puts a human face on it. And to bring it sort of to the modern times, one of the things that I got to see, working in the White House is all of these people who end up occupying those amazing spaces there, they're also very human, right? So, and so that's part of the idea that for the characters of Marissa and Clara, they don't like living there. They feel trapped. And so then this is just an escape, not just to get to another time, but just sort of to get out and have their own adventure, which I think, I think all kids kind of feel in one way or another that it would be nice to get out and do, have an adventure of their own. And of course, it's always nice to come home, though, after that, too. So it's kind of, what sort of inspired a lot of the book.
Yeah, the kids had, I know that the code names in the beginning of the story, I know even like just coming home from school seemed like a whole ordeal, like they had to go out a secret way out of the school, and just like you built that that tension up of like, wow, this is going to be very different now than how we were living before. So you saw from like being the first child how difficult, and just imagining even from an adult having to deal with that, and then being a kid and having to deal with that, like that's very big change, and
absolutely yeah. And even things like the code names and stuff, I ended up kind of finding out through research, and like, for example, I found out that the way it works is the president picks a code name, and then their family has to pick code names that all have the same letter as the president's code name. Same thing with the vice president. And that's kind of the way of sort of grouping. So Al Gore, I don't remember what his code name was when he was vice president, but I remembered reading that one of his daughters, she was told that she had to pick a code name that began with S, so she went with Smurfette. And as she got older, she was in the White House for 8 years. So here's this, she's a senior in high school and still being referred to as Smurfette by these people, with sunglasses and protective details, and she hated it. So, little things like that I think are amazing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like your knowledge that you bring to the story, and like working in the White House, you could definitely like see from this kid's perspective, like, wow, like this is going to be an adventure. And it was a really adventurous story, like, because at that time, like train travel, such a big part of life. Like it's like to go back in time to that time period of like train travel still being like a main way. If you're going to go on a long trip, that was the way that you would really, the main way. Like we're so used to like airplanes and commercial travel now. So for kids to see like what it was like, being on a train at that time period too, like I think that it was very interesting, like all the adventures they went on that, because the train takes up a large part of the story. So
it does. And yeah, I mean, trains are just inherently cool. There's just like, so many stories that involve trains, but part of it is, it's movement, and it is something different from what you're expecting. And, and the thing is, Teddy really did go on a big cross-country train trip in 1903, right around the same time that this all takes place. I played a little bit around with the locations where he ended up, but he really did end up. There's a point where he goes and visits Yellowstone National Park, which he had helped found up in Montana, and then later in that real trip, he goes out to the Yosemite Valley and he meets a naturalist named John Muir, who's one of the inspirations for there's a character in that book. It's not directly him, but it's inspired by him and a number of others. So it's Roosevelt, left a lot of just plain old stories, which as a speechwriter, I always was a story collector too, because, that makes a good speech is if you can find a good story and mix it in. So this just kind of freed me from having to come up with the speech side. I could go all story, and I love that.
Yeah, and you were able to take like bits and pieces. I know you said in like the back, like we were explaining about the book, like you were able to take from like some of his actual words, like from bits and pieces from actual parts of his real speeches, which was cool. Like you interwove into the story too.
Yeah. He left a lot of, there were a lot of speeches, and there was quotations, things, and I tried to make them work. And actually, in the early drafts, one of the big criticisms I was getting from my editor is, "Hey, stop writing speeches here, write a story." So what I did was I kind of cut down and made sure that if you're seeing a quote from him, that it actually fits within the flow and it contributes to the plot. So in some cases, those are quotes that he actually delivered on that trip. And then there's other ones that he wouldn't say, till like 10 years later. But there's nothing wrong with kind of thinking that if somebody says something in a speech 10 years later, that those thoughts were already in his head, ready to say privately to somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like so many, I don't know if the official term is like Teddyisms, it's just like incorporated into speech over time. And even like when he says bully, I didn't know like that whole meaning of that word, because there's a lot of places. I think on Long Island there's actually a restaurant called Teddy's Bully Bar, and I was like, oh, why is it called bully? And then when I read this book, I was like, oh, that makes complete sense. He's using it like to mean like cool, like
it was a positive term. That's exactly right. Yeah, cool. Like he even, there's a term that we now commonly use called the bully pulpit, which is, it refers to being able to give a speech and kind of command attention. But it all stems from, Teddy Roosevelt saying that the presidency was a bully pulpit, by which he means it's just a cool platform. It's, you have this advantage over everybody else because when you start talking, people will listen. And I thought he used that bully pulpit really well. That's one of the things that kind of marked his presidency. So.
Exactly. Yeah. He was like a very good speaker. And I feel like even wasn't there, I could be wrong. I don't know if I'm mistaking him for someone else, but wasn't he like attempted, someone shot at him at one of his speeches?
Yes.
So exactly I'm remembering that, and he actually still kept speaking or something like that. Something happened.
He kept speaking. He was actually saved by the fact that while he was a very good speaker and very good quotable and all of that, his speeches were ridiculously long.
Yes.
And that probably saved his life, because apparently it was the folded up speech in his pocket.
In his pocket, right. That's what I was thinking, something saved, and like he kept speaking, he had that folded up. So that was an interesting, I didn't know about him too. There's so many interesting things about Teddy Roosevelt too. And like I think like children don't really learn in school. I could be wrong about the Spanish-American War because I didn't really touch upon that. So I liked that through reading this book, kids could learn about that too, because that was such an important time in history. And really Texas didn't we acquire that through?
It's all complicated, like Puerto Rico, and then ended up being Cuba and the Philippines. And those became independent, and it's so complicated. And that war itself was kind of a weird one. There's, I've become kind of interested in weird wars because we don't talk about them much, partially because we don't really even know what to say. Right. My next book is going to be about the War of 1812, and there's some amazing stories involved that, including some that happened out on Long Island, by the way, with some sailing ships. But nobody knows, partially because the War of 1812 was started for strange reasons. It was controversial at the time. It ended weirdly, kind of in a tie, and so the only people who know about the War of 1812 are Canadians. If you go up to, I was in Montreal and just all over the place. They were
Yes.
like, and this is when we kicked the Americans out.
Right.
So, but yeah, so and the Spanish American War, when I used to work for Vice President Biden, his offices, the vice president's offices, so these are the offices that Kamala Harris now occupies, are the old Secretary of the Navy suites in the old executive office building. So there's this really ornate, nice wooden type of office that was Teddy Roosevelt's.
Oh, wow.
Because he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So I spent a lot of time in his actual office. And that's where he basically started the Spanish-American War all on his own by, ordering the fleet to go to Havana when his boss was on vacation. So it's just, he's a very impetuous guy. Very, very controversial, really. I mean, I tell that as a funny story, but that's a little messed up that, he could launch a war that way. But that's who he was. And that's, his connection to history. Like the Panama Canal came out of all of that too. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And so you looked at letters and different, how did your whole process of coming to wanting to write this specifically about Teddy Roosevelt as the first book, and this is going to be a series, why did you want to start with him specifically?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I find Teddy Roosevelt fascinating, and there is a lot of really good books that have been written on the subject. Mm-hmm. So while I'd love to claim that I did a whole lot of original research, really a lot of it was looking at what other people had written and and all that. But then when there were gaps to fill, then absolutely I'd go through the stacks and I'd go and find original papers where I could. As to why I'm starting with Teddy is it really does come down to the fact that we were fascinated with his family, just reading about these kids, reading about the pets, reading about the times. And also, to be honest, it's one of the easier ones. If you think about all the different presidential times, not many of them have had kind of school-age children in the White House. Certainly didn't want to do anybody from the time that I was alive. I want some historical distance here, and I think the fact that as you were talking about, the fact that train travel was such a big thing. 1900 in 1903 when this takes place, that's really was one of the biggest transformational moments in the country. So it was it was cool, and so then we ended up kind of exploring what type of thing. Originally, they weren't even going to leave the White House. It was just they would have little adventures around there. But then we figured, no, this story has to be bigger. And then we found this focal point that they need to have a mission. What's their mission going to be? And we thought about the sequoias and the redwoods out in the forest, which were really very much in danger in 1903. And in actual fact, 95% of those forests did get cut down, but the 5% that remain are why we know about these trees and we can preserve them. It was a real possibility that they were all going to be gone. And Roosevelt's one of the people who prevented that.
And being out to California, it's absolutely magnificent seeing those parks. I went into where the redwoods are. If someone hasn't been, it's so magnificent and cool and just so serene, environment. And I think we forget, even in that time period, they were dealing with industrialists. People they had environmental concerns in that time. So
no, I mean, there were people who ended up, these things didn't happen by accident. There were people who ended up kind of fighting to preserve things, and that's why we have what we have now. So yeah, and it's important to remember that too, because it's kind of a constant fight. It's it's always a struggle to make sure that these things get preserved, even as climate change is happening. Think about the forests out in Hawaii now that are never going to be the same in Maui. So part of that is nature, but part of that is really our impact on the world. So
it's amazing. With the wildfires this year, we've had a lot of kids, and adults asking for books for kids about wildfires, because they've always been a thing, but I never remembered, especially in New York, we had the sky was orange, it was the craziest thing. And a lot of kids
actually experienced it. Yeah,
yes.
the smoke came to visit the New York area. Right. Yeah.
Right. So a lot of kids, and I think that they are becoming interested in, these environmental, like natural disasters, different things going on, because this year it just seems like we've been hit with so much. And I was actually in Maui only months before the
Yeah.
wildfire and people have asked me, children, adults, like, how does that happen? Maui's like surrounded by water. Like, how does that
Right.
come
Yeah.
to, and not realizing like how, how dry the environment can be, like what are the environment factors that cause wildfires. So I think that kids are interested in reading about books about environmental concerns,
Yeah.
even in today, because we connect to the past. Like, there's always things that come up again, like in history, like, history does repeat itself. That's used all the time, but it
It's
can
true. It's
enough,
because it's true. Yeah.
yeah. So how can we do better, for the future? And like, as you say, Roosevelt was a complicated figure in history, and
Yep.
he had a lot of good things, but he acted kind of like brash or just like kind of quickly about some other things. But,
Absolutely. No, I mean, he's got a lousy record on some things. And even when we talk about national parks, we have to remember that, they had a complicated relationship with Native Americans who were there
right,
first. And, the Park Service has done some good strides lately to kind of reconcile that. But originally it was like, oh, no, this is private land, public land, which means nobody can live here. Which is like, whoa, what? So it's all of these things, we can be grateful to previous generations for everything they did to preserve and to set up things, but we also all have a responsibility to kind of do a little better. And I think kids feel that keenly, which is why it was important within this book, to sort of give these kids some ability to, take action on their own. And actually do stuff, right? Dare greatly is the phrase that, which is a Roosevelt phrase, but the idea that everybody has to actually take some action, or else you can't rely on things turning out okay.
exactly. Like we all need to, like, everyone needs to take action, and kids definitely see that. Like we all need to contribute. We need to, set a good example
Yeah,
to children too, that this is important, and not something we could just disregard, because look at like what can happen as a consequence. We get
100%. Yep.
Yeah, that can happen. And I was wondering what you thought, like if you were to give advice like to kids like who wanted to, take action, like to help their environment, or if they wanted to go into like writing,
Mhm.
like what could they do? Like what would be the best way that they would get into that?
Yeah, well, I think in both cases, whether it's taking action or getting into writing, it's reading is a huge, huge amount of it, because that's it gives you perspectives, it gets you, thinking, and engage with everything. Even if you disagree with it, that's fine. That's engaging. Um, but just you know the as far as taking action goes, I am a big believer in doing something local if you can. um, I was actually recently up in Vermont, and there was some terrible flooding that happened there. And but we were safe. We were in an area that really hadn't gotten hit that hard. And listening to the radio, listening to all the things, and you kind of get this, oh, isn't that terrible? Oh well, maybe we should contribute some money or something. And then when we're walking in downtown Hardwick, somebody basically just like asked, "Hey, can you help come and muck out this house thing?" And just suddenly now I volunteered to be standing there and actually like pulling things out of a basement that was flooded. And that
Right.
is some kind of direct action. You can really get paralyzed to stay out of things and feel like, oh, you come up with a million excuses. But I think kids rightly don't have much patience for that. They want to do things. And the main thing is to understand that yes, you can actually, you may not change the world, but you can change one person's life, you can change their family's life, and that's really a good use of your time.
Right. I think that that makes complete sense, and that kids know, like, I think that they realize themselves, like even doing small things, like helping their community, helping a friend with something, like
Yeah,
that goes a long way. So
absolutely.
that, yeah.
Yeah, no, sometimes it's even just a matter of speaking up. If you see something in your school, or you see bullying happen, it's really hard to speak up against that, but it's the right thing to do.
They know, yeah.
Yeah.
And kids, like, they really like sense it. They're like inherently like sense, and I think that that'll they try to help if they can, to be a good
Yeah.
friend and like speak up when they can. And that could be through writing if, they don't feel comfortable. Like, is there a way, like, if bullying is going on, you can like express it through writing. How can we make like our school better?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Ways like that, whatever they feel comfortable in ways of expressing themselves. And writing is a different way of expressing themselves too.
100%. Absolutely. So I like, this is my first published book. I'm super excited about it, but I've been kind of writing my whole life, and just like most of it is just stuff that, nobody's ever seen or but that's okay. I think kids should always be writing and coming up with stuff in whatever way they can, whether it's, writing songs, writing poetry, writing stories, writing nonfiction, trying to write their own speeches. Hey, that's cool.
Right. How long did it take you to write this book, and how difficult was that transition to go into like writing a book for children opposed to the other writing you've done?
So I was surprised at how easy it was that I became, I guess I'm a children's author now. That was really kind of, coming from not only being around my kids, but also reading a lot of children's fiction.
Right.
My younger child, she liked to have me read to her for years, and that was cool. I got exposed to a lot of stuff. You know, it was difficult learning how to write long form fiction. Over the course of about 8 years from the first draft to now, it was a lot of going back and forth, and it was being told, hey, you just need to kind of take a step back and figure out how to shape characters and how to organize a story. And it was almost like a little mini graduate school, going through that process. So I do think I'm in the process of writing the second book now, and it is flowing but easier. But it was a really, really neat learning process to get to this point, and I'm proud of how it turned out.
Yeah, I think it turned out great. Like, I find like sometimes when I have to read books for podcasts, this is definitely like I'm being 100% honest. Like, I'm not so in sometimes
Sure.
I'm not as enthused about, but this, I could see a kid even like, getting through this book that's a reluctant reader, because there's so much to the book. Even if you don't like history, like there's
Right.
adventure to it. Like, if you're looking for a book about, escapism, like it's time travel. So like, and even kids
Yeah.
that don't like direct, like outright, it's not really fantasy, but like the element of time travel in it, that they're able to time travel back to that time period. It's like you're learning about real historic figures. So I think that it'll appeal to a wide audience.
Well, good. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
That's definitely the goal. And I don't want it to feel like, okay, now we're having a history lesson. No, I
Yeah.
want this to be fun. I want this to be the type of thing that uh that after you've been told to turn your light out, then you're going to sneak a flashlight in under the blankets and keep going with it. That's what I want.
I think I read it in an hour and a half. So I'm like, I'm sure the kids read
Great.
it faster than me. So I really enjoyed it. And
Cool.
it was really great. And I can't wait for the next book you said, which is going to focus on the War of 1812.
War of 1812, yeah. And so that's a time period that most people don't know all that much about. I do know more than most because I used to work for the Navy. That's the only reason. So, I was a speechwriter for the Secretary of the Navy at one point. And, like I said, you end up collecting stories. You end up hearing things, and you use it in speeches and different things, but also it just got me interested in it.
Right.
So, and I think that, okay, they've had a train travel adventure, and now maybe we put them on some sailing ships or some horses or something. So
yeah, and the War of 1812 definitely, as you said before, like I learned very briefly about in school. I feel like everyone learns about the famous incident of Dolly Madison saving the portrait in the White House. Like, that was the biggest thing that I remember, and it going on fire. Like,
yeah.
I think that's like what we all learn as kids, and then we really don't learn unless you take courses, or you're taking an AP course or something where you really go into more in depth. But it's definitely, I feel embarrassed to say I'm pretty ignorant that time period in history.
You shouldn't be, because it's it is one of those sort of weird periods in time where it's just like, okay, why did that happen? And then you find out that, like, historians have been debating about that forever. And at the time, it was so controversial that people are actually fighting in the streets about whether to go to war or not. We think that type of stuff is modern, we think, but this country has a great tradition of protest and debate and things, and it was really on full display during all of that. So yeah, there's a book called The Perilous Fight that really kind of ended up turning me on to what the whole history of it is. I'm blanking out on the author right now, but it was a good introduction to that time period.
So that's going to be really great. Like, readers are going to really devour this book very quickly, and then we're going to have our second, and it's going to be in the White Clubhouse
series, right, of
course, again with the same characters, Marissa and Clara.
That's right. Yeah. So the idea is that their mom's still president. They're stuck there, and so, but they kind of use the White House. There's the clubhouse underground that connects them to all these different time periods, and that, forget about traveling time. Just even having your own little hidden space is part of the appeal there. My daughter actually fixed up the turret in our house, and that's a space I can barely fit into, but that's her hangout.
Nice. So that's like the clubhouse.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's going to be really, really exciting, and we're so excited for this book coming out October 3rd, White House Clubhouse. And the illustrations, I didn't want to talk about them too much because it says not final, but there are going to be illustrations in the
absolutely, yes. And what you have there, so I actually now have the final. I know we're recording this, not your video, but so this is the final hardcover, just arrived. And yeah, it's I really like what ended up happening with all the different pictures. And Karen is the illustrator, and she did a fantastic job.
I really thought that they were great too, and I like that the chapters were not so overlong also, and the illustrations broke up the story too, because I feel like those kinds of books like really help a reader. I find that it helps you read the story very quickly, because there's nothing that could be worse sometimes when the chapters are super long and sometimes they don't even connect the thoughts together. So I thought that was really well done, and I enjoyed the illustrations a lot, especially a lot of the train sequence illustrations. I thought the action was played really well. That was exciting to read, and then see the illustrations too. So I'm like, I hope these are in the final edition of the book. And
yeah, they are, and there's going to be a few more pictures that you get to see as well.
Oh, so cool.
Karen Lee did all the illustrations, Karynlee, and she is fantastic. So yeah, really, really happy with how this thing turned out.
Yeah, so October 3rd, we'll expect to see this on bookshelves and at the library, White House Clubhouse. So thank you so much for speaking with me about this book today. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. This was great. I'll have to come see you up in Syosset. So.
Yeah, that would be really great. Yeah, come and visit us here.
All right, will do. All right, have a great day.
Thanks, Sean.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
We're now concluding this episode of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.